On the early morning of July 30th, 2016, a hot air balloon carrying 15 passengers and one pilot descended through a thick layer of fog toward its landing spot near Lockhart, Texas. Below the basket, cloud and fog blurred the landscape, hiding trees, towers, and power lines. For a hot air balloon pilot, this was close to the worst possible situation for landing. With almost no ability to steer, the 16 on board relied entirely on visibility, sound judgment, and good weather to land safely. On this morning, all three were missing. But this wasn't a sudden change in weather. This was forecasted long before they even took off. Suddenly, as the balloon descended through the fog, a set of high-voltage power lines emerged from the mist directly in its path. There was no warning, no time to climb, and no way to turn. The balloon struck the wires, and electrical arcing surged through the support cables, severing them instantly, causing the basket to plunge 100 feet toward the ground. As it fell, the fuel lines ripped open, releasing propane that ignited in mid-air, engulfing the basket and its occupants in flames. What had been a functioning aircraft moments earlier was now scattered across the landscape. 16 people had been on board, none survived. In the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, responders arriving on the scene found the burned-out remains of the basket beneath the power lines and the fire still burning. High-voltage power lines crossed over the crash site, while the envelope and burner assembly had drifted another half-mile to the north. All 16 occupants suffered fatal injuries, ranging from blunt force trauma to severe burns and inhalation of smoke. This was not a minor incident, it was a full-scale catastrophe and the deadliest hot air ballooning disaster in United States history. So, what had led to this critical chain of events? Why was a hot air balloon flying in such unfavorable conditions? At around 6:30 a.m. that morning, 15 passengers, a pilot and a small ground crew gathered at Fentress Air Park in preparation for a relaxing balloon ride out over the Texas sunrise. According to the weather forecast checked by the pilot roughly 1 hour and 50 minutes before launch, a flight based on visual flight rules was possible, although clouds were forecasted at 1,100 feet and there was a chance of some fog. However, as mentioned, this forecast was from almost 2 hours before the flight. New reports showed worsening conditions, just 2 miles of visibility, mist and fog, and a lower cloud ceiling of just 700 feet. Another balloon operator in the area cancelled their flights based on these conditions. Hot air balloons have no steering wheel, no evasive power, and no second chance. They go where the wind takes them. In clear, calm weather, that's manageable. In poor conditions, it's a gamble. But the pilot for this flight, however, had unfortunately not checked the updated forecast and planned to go ahead with the flight. It was his first poor decision of the day. It would not, however, be his last. To understand this fully, we need to examine the pilot. Piloting the day's flight was 49-year-old Alfred Nichols, owner-operator of Heart of Texas hot air balloon rides. He had held a commercial balloon license since the early 90s and ran his business with a small part-time ground crew. His decision to fly that day wasn't the first poor choice he had made. Official records showed a long history of criminal offences. These included multiple driving while intoxicated convictions, possession of illicit substances, possession of controlled substances, and operating vehicles with suspended or revoked licenses, and was even labelled both a persistent and aggravated offender. Alongside this, he had multiple documented psychiatric conditions and was taking several powerful medications, some listed by the FAA as medications pilots should not fly on, and would likely have resulted in a denied medical certificate had he been required to disclose them. Conditions and substances that investigators would later link directly to his impaired decision-making that morning. But as a commercial balloon pilot, no medical certificate was required. The system relied heavily on voluntary compliance and self-disclosure. This all leads to a larger question. How was a commercial pilot carrying paying passengers allowed to operate without meaningful oversight? As with many leisure activities throughout the United States, hot air ballooning and its safety relied heavily on self-regulation and self-reporting. Although an airplane pilot must undergo regular medical examinations, at the time of this accident, balloon pilots carrying paying passengers were exempt. At around 6:58 a.m., Nicholas and his 15 passengers lifted off from Fentress Air Park just after sunrise, heading north. Almost immediately, however, the weather problems became apparent. This photograph, taken just 5 minutes into the flight, already shows early signs of mist and low cloud forming along the route. 14 minutes later, conditions had deteriorated further, demonstrating how unsuitable the morning had become for ballooning. Ground crew would later report watching the balloon disappear into cloud, reappear briefly, then vanish and emerge again. Yet, photographs taken between 24 and 27 minutes into the flight still showed the ground visible through broken cloud. Even as conditions worsened, clear opportunities for a safe landing remained, and investigators would later conclude that the pilot should have brought the balloon down while visibility still allowed it. At around 7:10 a.m., Nichols finally began his descent. As captured here, the balloon was now above a thick cloud layer, extending toward the horizon with the ground largely hidden. This image, captured 2 minutes before the accident, shows the balloon's shadow reflecting off the clouds and a power line tower just visible through the break. As the descent continued in poor visibility, the balloon dropped toward the surface through broken clouds and mist. Suddenly, almost without warning, the balloon's flight path intercepted the power lines as it descended from the fog. With almost no time to react, the balloon struck the high-voltage wires. Electrical arcing surged through the support cables, separating the basket from its envelope and causing it to fall 100 feet to the ground below, all while engulfed in flames. All 16 occupants were killed. The investigation into the tragedy was conducted by the National Transportation Safety Board with support from the Federal Aviation Administration. Examination of the wreckage quickly ruled out mechanical failure, and there was no structural defects prior to the crash. In other words, the cause of the crash was human error. The NTSB identified 3 critical points: before launch, during the flight, and during descent. At each stage, weather conditions were unsuitable for safe flying. The pilot had checked the weather forecast early, but failed to get an update which showed worsening conditions and reduced visibility. Fog and low cloud appeared within minutes. Safe landing spots were available while the ground was still visible. Instead, he continued into deteriorating conditions, making a safe landing more hazardous. The NTSB concluded that the probable cause of the accident was a pattern of poor choices. Contributing factors included the pilot's medical conditions and medications, as well as the FAA's policy to exempt balloon pilots from medical certification. The pilot's autopsy detected therapeutic levels of multiple medications that impair the central nervous system, including diazepam, oxycodone, cyclobenzaprine, and diphenhydramine. Medications known to cause sedation and degrade cognitive performance, including vigilance, reaction time, and decision-making. The NTSB concluded these factors likely impaired his judgment and contributed to a pattern of unsafe decision-making that morning. Following the findings, the NTSB issued several safety recommendations. One called for removing the exemptions of medical certification for commercial hot air balloon pilots. Another called for the FAA to improve industry oversight. The NTSB's recommendations were incorporated into legislative efforts, including a new federal law that mandated medical exams for commercial balloon pilots. The Lockhart balloon tragedy wasn't the result of a single mistake. Rather, Several risky choices made in full view of worsening conditions. Hot air balloons depend on visibility and judgment. On July 30th, 2016, both were missing, and 16 people paid the price. That's all for today's video. If you found value in it, I'd love it if you subscribed and joined me for the next one. To watch my coverage of a hot air balloon accident here in New Zealand, you can click the link on screen. And as always, thanks for watching.